I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, just a few little notes here. Our bank balance is $1,778.47. We're doing very well. And we just went from 49 paid members to 55. So thank you. We're doing very well. All right, now, tonight our presentation is by Jeff Ludwig, who is the Director of Education at the Seward House in Auburn. We've had Jeff here before, and it's always been a lively discussion. So thank you so much for coming back. Yay, Jeff. And we also have cookies.
And we have cookies. Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks. So nice to see some familiar faces. I love that I get invited back. I hope that for any of you who might have seen a few of my previous talks, this is not too repetitive, because I will admit to recycling a teeny tiny bit of my usual Lincoln and Seward talk for tonight's special, which usually only gets requested about this week and next week. Now, you probably, it's very self-aggrandizing for anybody who works at Seward House to start putting Seward's name on everything. Oh, he's the Alaska guy. He did so much for our country. Would you believe he's also, not singularly, but also largely responsible for at least establishing and standardizing Thanksgiving as a national holiday. If you don't believe me yet, that's okay. I'm going to take you back in time and prove it. And the way I want to do that is tell you that story, do a little bit of history of Thanksgiving and overview, but use the Thanksgiving Proclamation, of which my title tonight, Blessings of Fruitful Fields and Healthful Skies, is pulled from as an example of the relationship that William Seward and Abraham Lincoln brokered together over 4 years in the White House during the American Civil War. They entered the administration as arch rivals, and I'll talk about some of the animosity tonight, and by the end of the war, they become incredibly close. And the story of Thanksgiving is in many ways the story of their working relationship and the trust that Seward had gained from Lincoln over the course of this year. And it's also a story tied up in war. We feel like we're a divided nation at times, especially in the 1860s, and in many ways, the establishing of a standard practice Thanksgiving for all Americans, regardless of where they live, was an attempt at unification during a very polarizing moment. So maybe good as we head into our own holiday, early Thanksgiving wishes for all of you, to remind ourselves of that fact. This was supposed to be something that brought Americans of all backgrounds together to give thanks for what we have and what keeps us together. So, without further ado, I've got a volunteer on my slides tonight. There we go. You've got it. You're hired. I want to give you just a little bit of background history of two men who are central. Now, I don't want to give them all the credit. At the back of the Thanksgiving story is one some of you may have heard of, Sarah Hale, who is really considered to be the mother of American Thanksgiving, who makes a career, 40 years of pushing and agitating, lobbying administration after administration, congressman, senator after senator, to try to establish an American practice of Thanksgiving. As we'll discuss tonight, before the 1860s, there was no American Thanksgiving. Every state had their own traditions, their own customs, and their own practices. And some years, presidents could just call for Thanksgiving after something good happened. George Washington called Thanksgiving after a battle in the war. And so Lincoln calls for 9 different Thanksgiving celebrations in 4 years. When something good happens, we should give thanks, take a day off, and reflect. It wasn't always about doing this around a time of harvest and bounty. In fact, the Puritans, with whom we credit for establishing Thanksgiving, are famous for feasting, but Puritanical Thanksgivings were mostly about fasting and prayer and withholding from oneself, not enjoying a rich and decadent day of food. So may I present to you a man you probably know fairly well, Abraham Lincoln to the left there, and William Henry Seward to the right. They met only one time before they met squaring off in presidential level politics, both candidates of a new Republican Party vying for their party's nomination and the presidency in 1860. Clearly both men of the 19th century. Seward is about 8 years older. and I'll give you some brief biographies. If I could have the next slide, please. Now, in my ordinary Seward Lincoln talk, which takes about an hour, and really build up their backstory, I have a number of points. I'm not going to emphasize all of them today, but these were ultimately the things that I contend when I talk about Lincoln and Seward more generally, that brought these two men together through tension and trauma and the strains of Civil War to make a lasting, at least an intense, if not lasting, friendship. You can read for yourself some of the things that they found in each other during a very trying moment, the trial of Civil War. But I'll call your attention instead to something Abraham Lincoln once said about how to make friends, how to bring out the best in people. It's an old and a true maxim, Lincoln said, that a drop of honey catches more flies than a gallon of gall. So with men, if you would win a man to your cause, first, convince him you are his sincere friend. Therein is a drop of honey that catches his heart, which, say what he will, is the great high road to his reason, and which, once gained, you will find but little trouble in convincing his judgment of the justice of your cause, if indeed that really be a just one. A drop of honey, a little sweetness, opening yourself up to somebody else, even if they're very different from you. And this is the exact approach Lincoln will take, not only with Seward, but the many diverging and interesting characters and personalities that he folds into his administration, the so-called team of rivals. And Thanksgiving is part of this honeyed story of Lincoln letting people speak their piece, take their opinions seriously, consider them, and sometimes try ideas that weren't his own, and also sharing credit for ideas that maybe he shaped, but were delivered by somebody else. Next slide, please. Here's our man in Auburn, William Henry Seward. As you saw, he was born in 1801 in Florida, New York. That's Orange County, downstate. He's one of 5 children, born to a fairly wealthy planter. His father, Samuel Swayze Seward, needed his children to help him work the land, all except William Henry, or Henry as they called him. As a grown man, he'd be about 5'4", 110, 120 pounds. He and his father quarreled often. His father's a Jeffersonian Democrat. Seward helps found the Whig, Republican opposition parties. His father enslaved people in Orange County. Seward becomes one of the leading New York and national anti-slavery proponents of the middle 19th century. And he leaves home at just 15 years old. His father basically kicks him out upstairs and foots the bill for Union College. Before that, he's had private tutors, and everything he needed has been provided for him. Dancing lessons and writing lessons, and to the manner born. He excels academically at Union. He graduates at 19 years old from Schenectady, top of his class, gives the commencement address. His father's listening. He comes out, he attacks slavery again. So, quarrelous relationship. And walks right in at 19 years old to a job at a law firm in Manhattan. Sounds pretty good to 19-year-olds, 39-year-olds, whoever old you are. But he gives it all up. He marries well, because when he is just 21 years old, he returns, escaping the New York City oppressive summer heat, to the family farm in Florida. And there is a young lady sitting in the kitchen, looking over at him, and he writes that his heart was lost. Her name was Frances Miller. She was from central New York. Her father had helped found Auburn in Cuyahoga County, Elijah Miller, the man who built what you all know today as the Seward House, had sent her off to Quaker boarding schools, and she was just finishing up at what is today the Emma Willard School in Troy, New York. She's 15, he's 19, they'll marry a few years later, so in their early 20s, and he comes west on the unfinished Erie Canal to try to win her hand. Arrives Christmas Eve, 1822. They court. He opens up a law practice, and in 1824 they get married. So it actually was their 200th anniversary. In 1828, there's a seismic political election, and Andrew Jackson wins the White House, defeating incumbent John Quincy Adams. Seward, devastated by the loss of this great statesman, enters politics himself in Adams's image, a northern anti-slavery statesman. He will go on at age 29 years old to be elected to the New York State Senate, serve a term there, and in his 30s, elected twice to the New York governorship. He is New York's 12th governor, one of the most charismatic since DeWitt Clinton, and has a proud record as governor. He builds up schools and libraries, expands the Erie Canal, invests in New York rail projects. He's a classic Whig, as we'll talk about, and he becomes a well-seasoned warrior in politics of anti-slavery. In New York State, for example, he closes loopholes that allowed, after New York became a free state in 1827, enslaved people to be transported through New York State. He refuses all requests to return fugitive enslaved persons. So he is a fast-rising star from an early age. His path is mostly well-lined with successes. And after 2 terms as New York governor, by the late 1840s, he is preparing to take a foot onto the national stage, where he hopes to become a U.S. Senator. And it is during that election cycle, 1848, he's 47 years old, one of the rising stars of his party of the anti-slavery movement, that he meets a guy, a little rough around the edges, that he dismisses as a primitive little lawyer from the prairie. Next slide, please. That man, of course, was Abraham Lincoln. Born in February 1809 in Kentucky, the wilds of Kentucky, Lincoln had none of the inborn advantages that Seward knew. His father was always sort of a boom-bust would-be farmer. He moves the family when Lincoln's about 7 from Kentucky to Indiana to Illinois. He relies on his strapping son, a physical specimen, to help him clear land, cut trees. The log splitter, Abraham Lincoln has, across his entire childhood and teenage years, collectively about 1 total year of education that is patched together from a number of little country schools. He is the definition of a self-made man. He teaches himself everything he needs to know. He would walk miles to borrow books from neighbors and then return those books. And he had a great and capacious mind. He could memorize. He was analytical. He was very adept at storytelling and always having a moral to his story. He could carry a room. And the last stop, after going from Indiana, is of course Illinois. And his father basically holds him to the land, almost as an indentured son, until he's 21 years old, at which point he leaves and he moves to New Salem, a bustling village of about 300 souls. In his early 20s, he starts working in a store, and the great game of the time was listening to debates and speeches, and of course, watching the great lawyers take up into the courtroom and orating their arguments. He didn't have the credentials Seward had. He doesn't have a college education. He's not going to read the law under well-heeled attorneys. He begins to mimic what other attorneys say. He begins to read law books. And he prepares himself, working at a store by day, to take on a career in law. It's fascinating for him. He will do what's called riding the circuit. He rides through a swath of southern Illinois about the size of Rhode Island, and lawyers and a judge would travel town to town, and every so often they'd come to your town, they'd handle all the legal matters of the pioneer, they move on to the next one. So he's enjoying this life. It's something he's very talented at, and he meets a young woman named Mary Todd along the way in the 1830s, who's from Kentucky blue blood stock. Her father, Robert Todd, had been a congressman and a senator from Kentucky, had been a close friend of Henry Clay. Lincoln courts her, and he has the advantages, once they marry, a family name and family wealth, and the ambition of her behind him. Although, like William Seward, there was often a strained marriage. They were apart for a long time. Some of the bullet points you would have seen earlier is they struggled through losing children and having to put ambition sometimes ahead of being home and being emotionally available. He could be a very diffident and distant husband, father, and person in general. For him, the law, as it is for Seward, prepares him very well. He becomes eloquent, he becomes a little more polished, and in 1834, he runs for the Illinois Assembly. His idea is he wants to do for Illinois what DeWitt Clinton does for New York, to build up massive public projects to improve the West, like the Erie Canal. So he's off to politics. He serves 4 terms as a Whig. We'll get into what that means. And then, after some setbacks, he runs for the U.S. Congress in 1846. He's a sitting U.S. congressman then in 1848, which is a presidential election year. A lot's happening all at once. The Mexican-American War has died down. It was quite unpopular by the end, seen as a land grab to extend slavery into Texas, into the Mexican territories. Zachary Taylor will be elected as a Whig candidate for president that year. Lincoln as a congressional Whig from Illinois, and Seward is rising up from New York. If I could have the next slide, please. Here they are, the big Whigs, rising stars of the Whig Party. Now, as we all know, the party no longer exists. It lived for about a generation. It was a response to Andrew Jackson's populist movement. Whigs were proponents of internal improvements, a regulated financial system, public investments in education. It was an anti-slavery platform that believed in a responsible vision for Western expansion, for free settlement and free soil, and economic expansion, protectivist domestic politics, protecting American industry through tariffs, which are all in the news again. Can I get the next slide, please? So in 1848, these two men cross paths. William Seward is on the stump for Taylor. He is a big deal, and he's crisscrossing New York State and New England states. He's giving big speeches for Taylor. Lincoln's not invited, but just like he was in Illinois, in the backcountry, he's drawn to the noise and the steam and the spectacle of politics. So he goes on the stump too. He's not an invited speaker anywhere, but he's kind of following the bandwagon. He wants to be a little bit bigger than he is. And he sees Seward keynote in September 1848 at Tremont Hall in Boston, a big rally for Taylor. Seward asked the big question of their time: can nothing be done about slavery in our country because the public conscience is inert, because we don't care? He said no, thunderously. Everything can and must be done. Slavery must be abolished, and together we can do it. Well, Lincoln is invited to speak after this, and Lincoln is usually second to none as an orator. But Lincoln, as we know him, has not quite emerged yet. He is still a bit of the raw hayseed. So he comes up and he follows Seward, and he talks about the importance of keeping Western lands free for settlement. But he hasn't yet come across a sort of a moral attack against slavery. He is mostly building his case that, well, we need to keep these lands open for settlement. He's not attacking slavery as some sort of reprehensible evil. He is trying to figure out what is best for sort of the common working man looking west. Interesting story is that hotel rooms back then were few and far between and hard to come by. So Lincoln and Seward are bumped up almost randomly that night in a lodging right by the hall. Now, Seward forgets this, ephemeral for him, this meeting not long after. He shares a lot of rooms, a lot of people on the dusty trail of politics. But Lincoln gets him talking that night. All night, talking and talking and talking. He later refreshed Seward's memory. Oh yeah, I remember now. We did spend the greater part of the night talking. I must have insisted the time had come for sharp definition of opinion and boldness of utterance. So they have this meeting together in Boston. They spend up the entire night after their speeches talking about the future of their country, talking about how the great problem of their time, slavery, might be solved. Seward had clear ideas. As he said, it must be abolished, ended right now, and together we can do it. It would be a long time before Lincoln agreed that was something that was constitutional and desirable. Next slide, please. They will not meet again in the 12 years that follow as the nation lurches towards a civil war, where you see Lincoln, I think many of you might agree with me, a great president, our greatest president. We tend to put him on a pedestal, revere him. We have President's Day around his birthday, and we should. And there was true greatness in him. But the path to the White House was not filled with laurels. All he has to his name before he wins is that one term in the U.S. Congress in the 1840s and 4 terms as a state representative in Illinois. He was an outside dark horse candidate without the baggage and the benefit of political experience. He goes back to Illinois in the 1850s, and he runs for Senate twice, loses both times, putting in a very valiant effort against Stephen Douglas in 1858, debating him 7 times in debates that captured the attention of the nation and put him on the map as someone who really was talented, if still a little bit raw. Meanwhile, Seward is in the eye of the storm. He's in Washington, D.C. throughout this decade as the country seems to be moving faster and faster into the camp of the pro-slavery South. He gets to Washington in time to find the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 pending. It strips power from states like New York to resist slavery. No longer could New York say, we're not going to return fugitive enslaved persons. The federal government says, you will, or you'll be thrown in jail. In response to this, Frances Seward, William Seward's political companion wife, begins to open her house up as a stop on the Underground Railroad in this act of defiance and resistance. He's there for Kansas, Nebraska, 1854, which seemingly opens up western land north of the old 3630 line, the Missouri Compromise of the 1820s, which said we're going to draw an imaginary line, a border line, and all states north of it will not be subjected to slavery, and all states south of it can be subjected to slavery. Stephen Douglas of Illinois says, nah, that line doesn't matter. Let the settlers vote by popular fiat, and they can decide whether they'll enter the Union as free or slave states. So it opens up a whole new world of possibilities for northern slavery. And it galvanizes Lincoln to make his return. By the later 1850s, the Dred Scott decision seemingly puts the lid on the coffin of the anti-slavery movement, which Supreme Court hands down saying a person of color can never be a citizen of the United States. The institution of slavery cannot be curtailed, let alone abolished anywhere. And states like New York have no right trying to stop the movement of enslaved people or the return of fugitive enslaved persons. The federal government really seemingly was moving behind the power of slavery. And our next slide, please. So, a polarizing moment. And at the end of the 1850s, William Seward, who'd made a name of himself as the voice for resistance during this time, assumes, well, who can stop this but me? He's so confident, so overconfident, he believes the only thing that can prevent his presidency is himself, some crucial mistake, perhaps too radical a flourish of rhetoric, such as in 1858, when in Rochester he says, there's an irrepressible conflict between our two sections, free and northern, enslaved and southern, and they cannot continue to coexist. One side must win out, and a revolution is coming, my friends, and we know revolutions only move one way, forward, towards progress. He believed that was true, but revolution is a scary word. It usually means violence and sacrifice and loss and destruction of status quo. His campaign manager, Thurlow Weed, said, we've got to get you out of here. We're going to send you to Europe. Cool it with that kind of talk until we get you elected. So he's traveling, and a man who was considered rather marginal in the party, as yet beardless, Abraham Lincoln, that also ran before his time, makes his move. Trying to secure Western votes, because the Republican Party, brand new, coming out of the mid-1850s, knows its base is in the Northeast. We need to win border states. We need Illinois. We need Michigan. We need Iowa. We need to play to the Western voter. Have their convention in Chicago, Illinois. And as Lincoln said, he knew he was going to be put on the ballot as a hometown favorite, as a sop to the Illinois delegation. He's not a serious candidate, but because we're being hosted by you, we're going to put one of your wigs on the ticket, and he can have his little moment and wave his little hat, and we'll cheer for him. No one's the serious candidates here. Next slide, please. But that is not what happened, as you all well know. While Seward is filled to the brim with confidence, a man with some ego, Lincoln runs a great upstart underdog campaign. He doesn't just run as some token symbol of a candidate on the hometown slate. He and his handlers, what was called the Wigwam Convention in Chicago, paint a very compelling picture. He is serious. Seward is a man who can't possibly win, Lincoln's team projects. They say he is far too divisive, far too radical, far too polarizing. He will never play in these border states that we need. We need a moderate, an outside voice like me, who might be able to squeak through the Electoral College, carrying the North and carrying 5 or 6, we talked about swing states today, very decisive border states on the border between North and South. Only through them was there a path to victory, and only could Lincoln win these states. Seward, who couldn't possibly lose in his base, could not play as well in an open general election. Not only that, But Seward had stepped on a lot of people on his way to the almost top. And his enemies come back from the tall grass in Chicago and throw their support behind Lincoln, a man that few know very well at all, as much to spite the frontrunner Seward as to endorse Lincoln. Few think there's greatness burgeoning within him, but most want to give Seward a black eye. And Lincoln makes a compelling case. Maybe he could do this. A lot of dark horse presidents have entered the White House under less auspicious circumstances and were good enough for party, if not for country. Our next slide, please. So out of the convention in Chicago, the Republican greats, Seward of New York, Bates of Missouri over here on the far right, Chase of Ohio standing on the far left, the front runners are all vanquished, including that key front runner, William Seward, and Abraham Lincoln comes out of Chicago an unknown victor and has to then spend 6 months introducing himself really to the country, asking for their votes. He benefited in Chicago for being part of a four-way race. Bates, the moderate, Seward, the radical, Chase, abolitionist. With a split party, he could win with just a core and shaving off supporters here and there. The same thing benefits him that November. He only wins with about 40% of the total popular vote because he was one of four candidates. The Democratic Party had been split into northern and southern factions. There was a unity party coming out of the South. And he gets exactly what he needs, a northern sweep almost, and he carries the western bloc of states. In between his election day in November of 1860, Lincoln victorious, and his inauguration day back then held in March, the Civil War all but begins as at first 7 southern states secede from Union. They've been in power not only for the last decade, but effectively for a generation. And now the balance of government is going to swing dramatically the other direction. The other side is going to take over everything and will now begin to impose its will against them. And rather than concede or become the loyal opposition, the South secedes from Union and forms a pro-slavery confederacy. All of this during the lame-duck period of James Buchanan's watch. Lincoln is powerless to do anything except build what we all know today as his team of rivals. The men who all disparaged him, like Seward, who calls him that little lawyer. Mary Todd Lincoln referred to Seward as that little abolitionist sneak thief. Secretary of State, Edward Bates, Attorney General, Chase to the Treasury, and will later be appointed Supreme Court Chief Justice by Lincoln. These were the rivals. Democrats are brought in. Buchanan's guy, Edwin Stanton, does war. Gideon Welles, an old Jacksonian battle axe, to Navy. Caleb Smith, Montgomery Blair, a bipartisan team that Lincoln hopes with many, many, many drops of honey can be brought onto his side for a coalition government to hold the Union together at its darkest hour. And I'm not here to tell you that story tonight, but we know that's exactly what happened. As Seward says, during some of the darkest moments of this period of disunion, one of my favorite Seward quotes, if you're ever feeling a little bit down about where the country's going at present, he says, "There's always enough virtue in this republic to save it, though sometimes not an extra drop to spare." Next slide. Okay. Now, this doesn't happen overnight. Seward doesn't just become besties with Abraham Lincoln. He'll get there. Instead, it is a roller coaster. Seward is offered the post of Secretary of State, top cabinet position, turns it down a few times where he's prevailed upon as a patriot to do this for his country. He agrees, though he makes it very clear that he expects that he'll be the premier in the administration and Lincoln an empty figurehead. He will soon be disabused of that. He's asked by a journalist before he's confirmed, was he disappointed in what was happening in this position? And he said, "You would speak of disappointment to me when I've been bested by this little lawyer. This is when he's going to be the nominee." Absolutely disappointed. And he puts to the test that Lincoln is going to be this empty vessel, this stuffed shirt and a stovepipe hat. And now, thanks to Grace Bedell, a whiskered tall fellow. And on April 1st, 1865, a few weeks into the administration, a little over a week before the first shots are fired at Fort Sumter and the war really begins, He delivers an unthinkable memorandum to the president, unthinkable for almost any other president. Imagine a subordinate of Joe Biden or Donald Trump handing something like this to the president, basically calling the president out for failing on the job in these earliest weeks. Seward, in no uncertain terms, says, "You don't know Washington. We are rudderless. We have no policy. We are adrift." He tells Lincoln that he is so distracted, beset by office seekers, next slide please, that he can't focus. There's a line outside his door, people wanting patronage. With all this going on, he can't effect a decent policy. And he offers that perhaps Lincoln would like to yield power to him. Perhaps I could run the government more effectively than you. And again, imagine this happening to a modern president, or most recently, the two we are thinking of tonight. And they'd be probably summarily fired. But that's not what happened. Lincoln uses this as a moment to drop that honey and win Seward's heart. He calls Seward to the White House, and he thanks him for his candor in this memo. He says, "This is exactly why you're here. I don't want you to be a yes man," now I'm paraphrasing, "but I want this kind of difficult, adversarial confrontation. Maybe not like this, leaked in my mailbox as a memorandum, but I brought you here because I want you to speak truth to power to me." And he makes him a deal. "Open door. Come and see me any time of day. My door is always open. Come in here. We'll sit up all day and all night if we have to, and we will hash out the issues of our country, our nation, on the brink of war together. And if at any point you can convince me that you're right and I have the wrong of it, we'll try things your way." This is, again, that drop of honey, that open-mindedness, and he asks Seward, "We have a deal, your loyalty in exchange for this open dialogue." Seward says yes, because he believes Lincoln will be a puppet, easily manipulated, and that he will have his way in the White House. By the end of his first year, he had been completely turned around, writing to his wife back in Auburn that Lincoln was the very best of us, though he needs my constant attention. He takes full advantage of that openness, and will admit the nation had chose better in Lincoln over Seward. Better a President Lincoln than a President Seward, because there was real greatness there. And he falls happily into line. And our next slide, please. Now, on a normal Lincoln-Seward kind of a talk, I'd break a lot of this down for you. I'm going to just run you quickly through, because I want to get to Thanksgiving as one of the great examples of the relationship that blooms between them. Okay. Ooh, okay. No, that's good, halfway there. The relationship that blooms between them. And the Seward biographer, John Taylor, nicely puts it, I think, when he writes, "In this gloomy time of the coming Civil War," which of course goes very badly for the Union, the first 2.5 years, "the growing personal friendship between Lincoln and Seward was proving to be a solace for both men. Not only did Seward have free run of the White House, but the president was a frequent visitor to the Seward residence as well, in Lafayette Square. And Seward rents a place just doors down from the White House to be near Lincoln for that proximity. Access in Washington is power, and nobody had more access during the Lincoln administration than William Seward." Next slide, please. As I talked about, or I wrote about in the title slide, these were both very funny men in an administration known for very sober, somber, and serious bearded figures. Lincoln has a nice beard. These two guys were old circuit lawyers who knew the power of a story well told and a joke well crafted. Humor can be the great diffuser. And they loved to rib each other. One of Lincoln's favorite jokes is here. And one of my favorites is they're riding around in Seward's carriage in Washington, D.C. over the rough cobbles of the city. And the driver lets out a string of swear words. And Lincoln sticks his head out the window and asks whether the driver was Presbyterian. And the guy says, "No, I'm Methodist." And Lincoln says, "Oh, well, I assumed you were Presbyterian because I've only ever heard Seward swear that much, and he's church elder." So that's the kind of relationship they had. Very playful. Next slide, please. And they enjoyed hearkening back to their time as younger men, country lawyers, often taking to the road and bringing justice dusty town after dusty town in the West, whether that was central New York or southern Illinois. In the Seward parlor, away from Mrs. Lincoln and the office seekers, Lincoln and Seward would stretch out in front of the fire and discuss anything that came to mind. Both men were lawyers, and for Lincoln, these visits may have been reminiscent of relaxed hours on the circuit of Illinois. They sit up, they're funny. Seward would smoke cigars and drink. Lincoln did not do either of those things, but would sit up and do that sort of backslapping joking. Next slide, please. And so in the darkest of times, they find some light in each other. Lincoln's personal secretary, William Stoddard, writes that conferences between Mr. Seward and Mr. Lincoln were of almost daily occurrence. And the iron hand discernible in the conduct of our foreign affairs, that's Seward, was not solely that of the shrewd and able head of the State Department. These conferences were generally held at the White House, to and from which Mr. Seward went and came with the easy familiarity of a household intimate, rather than with any observance of useless etiquette. It was not at all uncommon, however, for Mr. Lincoln to walk over to the State Department in the daytime, or to Mr. Seward's house in the evening, with or without an attending private secretary to carry the papers. Day in, day out, morning, noon, and night, these two men talking about everything. Yes, the war. Yes, foreign policy. But all the things they did to escape their words. But the war and foreign policy, next slide please, are going to be of paramount and critical importance. One of the things that Seward, is able to do in a manner reminiscent of Thanksgiving was that first great proclamation. He convinces Lincoln he's constitutionally and morally able to do. The Emancipation Proclamation. If you know your history, you know that Lincoln doesn't sign that into effect on day one of his administration. Until the halfway point of the war, he keeps the door ajar for the Confederacy to come willingly back to the Union, fold back in peacefully, and continue to have legal slavery in the American South. No longer spurring into the West, contained in your section, but legal slavery remained on the table if you put down your guns and come home willingly. Now, the Confederates were winning the war in its early going. Why would they basically surrender a war they're winning? But the offer was still there. Seward helps convince Lincoln he has the legal authority and that the effective strategy for turning the war is going to be issuing by presidential order a proclamation abolishing slavery. Something 240 years in the making. After the first enslaved persons arrived via Dutch ship in New York, with pen stroke, Seward, but mostly Lincoln, are going to end the institution in the areas where it existed in the Confederacy, followed by the 13th Amendment ending it everywhere. How does he do this? He gives him all the information he needs to know. He puts Frederick Douglass into the White House to talk to Lincoln. He encourages Lincoln to talk to the rank and file Union soldiers, who, when Lincoln asked them, "Hey, Bub, what's going on? Why are we losing?" They said the Southern Army is being fed by unfree labor back home. Lincoln, as told by Seward, when the world looks at us, they see a war that's about sovereignty and union, not the moral cause of anti-slavery. If we make this a war about ending slavery, great Western powers, the British and the French, which have outlawed the institution, will never enter the war themselves. We make this a moral war about slavery, and we can guarantee no foreign intervention. There are many strands that he helps weave together to convince Lincoln, little by little, that we can craft this together, and you can issue this, and it will hold up, and it will win the war, and it is the right thing to do. I don't want to give Lincoln no credit. He was no friend of slavery, but he was no radical either. And so it's through these series of conversations, Seward takes advantage of that aforementioned promise of dialogue. That drop of honey from Lincoln really does open his ears to be willing not to be hard-minded and to consider outside points of view, and they move closer to the position of, yes, emancipation. Seward becoming, in the process of this, and many other decisions made, his, Lincoln's, indispensable man. Okay, next slide, please. And, of course, he delivers great foreign policy. Here we can see on the night of the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln took a draft of his speech he was going to give and brought it to Seward for his comments. Okay, next slide, please. Now, let's get to Thanksgiving. If Seward has this much sway over matters foreign and domestic, how much time does he have to be trying to persuade Lincoln about slightly more minor affairs, like establishing a national holiday around Thanksgiving? Well, I'm here to tell you, plenty. Next slide, please. Thanksgiving was largely a northern holiday. But I want to quote for you from Seward's autobiography. By the time he's Secretary of State and they're in charge of the federal government, now the Lincoln administration is imposing federal order on the United States. And many in the South were trying to argue the Civil War was about states' rights and sovereignty, not slavery. So Seward writes, he strolls into the White House one fall day in 1863, and in his usual bantering, playful way, he starts off it's going to be a serious conversation with a quip. They say, Mr. President, that we're stealing away the rights of the states. So I have come today to advise you that there is another state right which I think we ought to steal. And the story goes on here. Well, Governor, what do you want to steal now? The right to name Thanksgiving Day. We ought to have one national holiday all over the country, instead of letting the governors of states name half a dozen different days. And as they did for everything else, they spend the rest of the day talking about this, arguing about this, until finally Seward reveals that in the pocket of his jacket, he just so happened to have taken the liberty of drafting a proclamation, and would Lincoln like to see it, and maybe they could issue this proclamation like they've done for other proclamations. It's not going to free 4 million people, but it can strike a chord for unity, and it can be a morale-boosting bit of proclamation during this turning point year of the war, a reminder of the ties that bind us. So, next slide, please. So what's he talking about? Oh, this slide. I love this slide because even at Lincoln Central, his home in Springfield, this is just on their website, they talk about Thanksgiving. They want to take credit for Lincoln having the Thanksgiving idea, but they do. Even in so doing, they talk about how October 1863, we'll come back to that, Lincoln issues this proclamation of Thanksgiving. We're going to come back to these words, but as they claim, they acknowledge the proclamation of National Thanksgiving, which sets our Thanksgivings into being in motion forever, was one of 9. Mr. Lincoln issued the proclamation but did not author it. Our modern Thanksgiving Day proclamation that standardized our holiday was 100% Seward, who uses his relationship with Lincoln to see it issued, and that's coming right from Springfield. Next slide, please. Before all this is a 1925 painting. Thanksgiving was chaotic, to say the least. Now, the traditional origin story we're all taught in school is that it's a New England-based thing. Plymouth Plantation, William Bradford, 1621, and those starving pilgrims are going to survive their first year and have this feast, gathering together to celebrate a bounty. Now, there are other vying narratives. Some say in 1607, a northern settlement in Maine had this. And in the 16th century, there was a Spanish-American Thanksgiving. But this one stuck. There was a guy named Edwin, I think his name was Ruffin, who was part of the plantation, who went back to England on a number of occasions, and he popularized this story. He brought letters back describing it, and he owned the narrative. He painted a picture of this 1621 feast as a coming together, as this transcendent moment between cultures and peoples, almost as if now these Puritan pilgrims who left England were being rewarded by the divine for their sacrifice and their belief. They did it again in 1623, and the rest is history. Now, if you think the people in Plymouth were doing this every year just like this, that's not at all true, but that's not necessary for a myth to be born, and for a mythology of American customs and traditions to go up around it, and the storytellers who would rise up as we become a nation during the American Revolution find a very compelling story here, better than all the rest, that we can teach our children. And in a moment when we're 13 fractious colonies united by nothing but ink and a light agreement to be a confederation, you need something stronger than that. The belief that we are one United States, not just because the Constitution says so, but because it's in the marrow of the fabric of our country. And stories like this can help fuse together many people into one. So it's a convenient, it's not wrong, but a convenient mythology to build a national identity around. And revolutionary figures knew that. Next slide, please. George Washington was keenly aware he might deserve the title of the father of our original Thanksgiving. George Washington, during his days as a general, would proclaim Thanksgiving in his capacity as commander. After Saratoga in 1777, he proclaimed it Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving could be used kind of loosey-goosey whenever you needed it. It need not be tied to a time on the calendar. When something good happens and we need to come together and give thanks, we can just take a day off and do that. It might not be about turkey, but it can be about togetherness. When he's president of the United States in 1789, he makes the first effort to standardize, or at least try to proclaim Thanksgiving. But he's very loose about it. In the early days, federal government was something to be viewed suspiciously. It was resembling the monarchy of the king that was just cast off and would not do for a strong central government to try to impose its will upon the people. Even during the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress would suggest to states, hey, no pressure, how about a Thanksgiving? We're going to recommend things. But up to the states, you decide, you want to do it. This was not something that, in today's terms, we would say, many leaders wanted to spend their political capital on. So it was sort of a suggested idea. But Washington himself really latched onto it. Next slide, please. He saw it and said, oh, let's go back a bit. We went a little too far. That's okay. We're going to hit this arrow. That's me. I'm going the wrong way. I do have some sound. Okay. And so in 1789, he has printed in all the newspapers, this one is from the Pennsylvania Packet, a proclamation. Now, therefore, I do recommend and assign Thursday, the 26th day of November next, to be devoted by the people of these states to the service of that great and glorious being who is the beneficent author of all good that was, that is, or that will be. We should have a day that brings us together as families, as a people, as a citizenry, as a populace, as a united whole. But Washington is reluctant to flex too much federalism. And though he issues this proclamation in 1789, he does not enforce it, and he does not revisit it, and he does not issue a second one until his last year in office. In 1795, heading into his last year, he issues another one. But again, it's much more suggestive. We should do this, not we will do this. Next slide, please. It's often wrapped in strongly religious terminology. We need to have this day of being thankful and praising God. When Thomas Jefferson gets to the White House in 1800, he thinks even what Washington did, these recommended Thanksgiving days, was the federal government overreaching and infringing on states' rights. And he says, wait a minute, I helped write the thing. We have a separation of church and state in this country. What are we doing having our president declare these days of Thanksgiving for God? That's against the rules. He's a man of secular enlightenment. He wants to separate the religious as far away from the politic as he can. So throughout the Jefferson administration, Thanksgiving dies. We will not have these days. We will not have these proclamations. And what happens afterwards, for the next 65 years, is that Thanksgiving was an issue of states' rights and localities. We did not have one Thanksgiving. We had a different set of legal Thanksgivings or not. In the southern states, it was not practiced much all over the country. As an educator at Lincoln's College wrote in an article a few years ago, for the next 65 years, Thanksgivings were established by governors of individual states, mostly in New England, other parts of the North. Now, New York was the first one to standardize it. In 1817, they set it on a Thursday in November, so we're going to do this every year exactly the same, put it in the books, we're going to calendar it. This is Thanksgiving. It's not going to change. Everywhere else, not so much. Presidential announcements were occasionally issued, but some states refused to create Thanksgiving. They said this was a remnant of Puritan zeal, and by the eve of the war, 25 of 32 states had some kind of a Thanksgiving. Next slide, please. From the Farmer's Almanac. Lest I give Lincoln and Seward too much credit, Throughout these years, from 1827 until 1863, when she was 74 years old, Sarah Josepha Hale made it her business. She had no legal power. She could not vote. She could not stand for office. She had the power of the pen, and what a writer she was. She's credited with the nursery rhyme, Mary Had a Little Lamb, and she was the editor of Godey's Ladies Book. So she had an audience of women, which gave her an indirect power, and she said, this is ridiculous. What an opportunity to knit this country together. We ought to have one Thanksgiving, one national holiday that we as Americans can revel in. And for 36 years, she publishes editorial columns. She personally petitions every president from Zach Taylor to Abraham Lincoln until she became such a pain that this mother of Thanksgiving was met with the great eye rolls of Washington, D.C. Yet she persisted until she found a sympathetic ear in one William Seward. Next slide, please, who always was a man of the press and knew how to influence Pell. And as she writes to Lincoln, to Seward, who gets it to Lincoln, you may have observed that for some years past there's been an increasing interest. This is good for votes. Popular. Increasing interest felt in our land to have Thanksgiving held the same day in all the states. It needs national recognition and authoritative fixation only to become permanently an American custom and institution. Lincoln had fallen into the pattern of every other president who came before him. Willy-nilly with Thanksgiving. He declared 9 of them in 4 years. 9 days of Thanksgiving. The first one in his first year, he declared only in the federal government of Washington, D.C. We're taking the day off. It was an internal use only Thanksgiving. And then, like George Washington, he kind of picked and chose, like, what day should we be thankful for? After the victory of Shiloh in 1862. That's Thanksgiving tomorrow. After Gettysburg and Vicksburg, Thanksgiving. I'm going to skip over October 3rd. September 3rd, the fall of Atlanta, Thanksgiving. October 20th is a repeat of the one on October 3rd. But this is the big one. October 3rd, 1863, that's the day that Seward came into Lincoln's White House, his proclamation already written in his breast pocket, saying, she's right, she's been right, this would be good for lots of reasons, not least nationalism, patriotism, and a distraction which we all need as hundreds of thousands of Americans are suffering, their children, their husbands, their brothers fighting this incredibly violent war. This is a balm and a reminder of why we are sacrificing. And Lincoln obviously agrees. And next slide, please. Now, all set against the backdrop of the Civil War. This is an illustration by Alfred Wild of Thanksgiving in a Civil War camp. Having this military call to action, I think, really accelerates. So many statesmen heard Sarah Hale out. Why is this a priority? It's not. But during a time of war and great national division, what sounded to many like a tired old lobby suddenly struck a new chord. Thanksgiving in the midst of war and deprivation. And next slide, please. Now, as Seward says to Lincoln, we ought to have one national holiday, just like Sarah said, all over the country, so letting the governors name half a dozen. Part of what he says. Next slide, please. Now, what I had prepared for you, look, I only wear this outfit on my Thanksgiving talk today. I don't have the sound for it, but we have a singer and actor, and you can go to our Facebook page or our YouTube page and find it. It's about 8, I'll just show you the picture. It's about 8 minutes into the slide, so I did not print out or have a text prepared for you of the, where's our Stewart? Not gonna work out. All for the best. Oh, there we go. We don't have sound anyway. But if you go to our social media, we have an actor dressed as Seward in Seward's library. That's where I'm standing here, and he reads the full text of Seward's proclamation. These bountiful fields and these skies. So I do not have the full text here for you. You all have homework. And your homework is, find our social media. It's only a 4-minute clip. It's a very short proclamation. It's about 2 pages long. And listen, imagine what Lincoln's voice might have sounded like, but no, it was Seward's words being issued from the president's mouth. And one last fun little piece of trivia. Have you ever wondered about the tradition of pardoning the Thanksgiving turkey? Well, I can't give Seward credit for that. Instead, credit belongs to Tad Lincoln, the scamp of a son. The Lincoln family, was given after that October 3rd proclamation, which named Thanksgiving November 26th, and in Lincoln's words, you would have heard this, but the fourth or final Thursday of November, here on after forever as our American Thanksgiving. A month later, he's given a turkey, and Tad becomes attached and says, "Gee, Pa, we can't kill him. His name's Jack. He's my friend." And Lincoln said, "Okay, we'll have something else for dinner tonight." And from that beginning, this is how myths are born. This is not done again until Harry Truman, but conjuring up the ghost of Lincoln, the way so many Americans in Lincoln's age might have conjured up Plymouth Plantation and those pilgrims, a new tradition is born in the spirit of Tad, of having a turkey come to the White House and being issued a presidential proclamation. Often hilarity ensues. The birds began to flap and perhaps bite at the presidents. And to this day, now, no matter what your political persuasion is, some of you are laughing at this. We can see through hard times and division, there's some unity here. You might not like half the people on this page, but you saw the turkey, and your heart melted just a little bit. That drop of honey, all the way from Lincoln to you. Questions?
Anybody have any questions, comments for Jeff?
Yes, sir.
Why is it that Washington and Lincoln chose Thursday?
That's they didn't always. I mean, Thursday was, I think, maybe why did Seward push Thursday on this date? A nice day to wrap the week up? It's a really good question, because Thursday was not sort of coded in until it was. And it wasn't considered altogether that sacrosanct. In 1939, FDR tries to move the date up. Let's push back a week and get more advantage of a longer season for shopping for this depression. They called it Franksgiving for Franklin Roosevelt. But I think once Lincoln said it, whatever the rationale was, Seward didn't write about it. I mean, we can probably all speculate, but I've never seen anywhere Lincoln, Seward, or others answer that question, why this day? I think it was generally a good time to capture harvest and to approximate when some of the, you know what, another thing is, you know what, I maybe just came to a good answer. When George Washington issues his very first one, he chooses the date November 26th. And November 26th in 1823 happened to be a Thursday. So Lincoln chose the exact date that Washington in his first year as our first president chose, and that date was available, and it was a Thursday.
Yeah, actually, I don't know if I missed it, but when Seward was kind of palling around with Lincoln, you know, very close to the White House and all that, what was his actual position or title?
He was Secretary of State. So officially, that meant that what he was supposed to be filling his days with was statecraft. I only had that side up for a moment. Mostly what he's doing, oh, that's the wrong one. Maybe I don't have it in here. But mostly what he's doing is trying to convince the rest of the world to remain neutral during the American Civil War. So he actually built up really the first modern intelligence gathering federal apparatus akin to a CIA today. And it's a propaganda arm designed to try to win hearts and minds in Europe, place spies across Europe, because he's in a game of chess with his Confederate counterpart Robert Toombs, who's trying to entice Western powers to come into the war openly, to bring soldiers and guns and openly support the Confederacy. which is part of the reason why Seward can convincingly tell Lincoln, if we tell the British this is a war about union and sovereignty and the strength of the Constitution is a voluntary document, well, Europe's going to feel like it can get involved in a discussion like that. But if we say this is a moral war about freedom versus slavery, they've already abolished slavery in their lands and in the waters. They can't, in good conscience, enter this. And they had every reason to want to, because their markets were tied up in southern cotton. So they had an economic interest. And if it was only a legal technicality, why are these two sides at war, then the rest of the world might feel empowered to step in. But if it was a battle for the soul of the country, maybe you let them work it out.
Just a comment, now I can see that they were such good friends, because my great-great-grandfather was a soldier under Secretary Seward's son in his regiment. So he's always saying, Seward's here, and he's brought Lincoln with him again, and so they all got to talk to Lincoln a lot. They mentioned, having parties with champagne and oysters at Fort Foote, if you know where that is. It's a huge fort, but the huge Rodman cannons are still there, near D.C.
They were called Seward's pets. They were the first year of the
Yes.
war. They saw no action.
Right.
And they mostly, they garrisoned forts in safe zones. So he became part of the Auburn 9th of the New York 138th. That was the command of William Seward's son, William Jr. And yes, Seward always goes to visit his son.
Yeah.
Lincoln comes too. Well, I'll talk to the men.
Yep. And so when my great-great-grandmother died, it was like, Nancy shook hands with Lincoln. You know what I mean? Because he was such a part of their regiment, coming to visit them and talking to them, and I'll have all these conversations and letters. I put on a play there at the Seward House.
You, in 2015?
Yes.
Yes, oh my gosh.
Yeah, I was texting Nancy, I'm here with your speaking, and she's, oh, he's wonderful. So
Yes.
Nancy Moran is my cousin.
I have a copy of that book still. That's right, I still have a copy of one of my first months at the job.
Yeah, it was really exciting to see, because when I was there, you had Seward's the son's outfit that was torn.
Yes.
And Charles, my ancestor, wrote about that, how he got torn, and the divorce and all that. It was fun.
That book is still on my shelf back at Seward House. Good to see you again for 10 years.
Yes, it's good to see you. So this is thrilling. I'm texting my husband. He's like, oh my gosh, because he came, because he's from Auburn. Anyway.
Well, Steve, I've got a whole William Jr. talk anytime you want it. It seems like giving people what they want.
Yes.
Okay.
That would be an awesome talk.
Well, I'll give it, and Uncle Walter and I will get dinner beforehand, and we'll meet back here again in 6 months.
So I still have Janet Seward, his wife's pound cake recipe.
Yes, we have pieces of wedding cake that they saved from weddings. Yes, they're in tins. They're
Do you really
blackened.
come back and talk about this? This has been awesome.
Yeah, email me.
Okay.
It's been so long.
Yeah, it's been so long. I don't know if I
I don't think it would be like a repeat.
Bring the cake. Bring
the entire liquid.
Okay.
We can read a couple of the letters together.
Get the costumes.
Yeah,
That's what
I
we did.
still have my dress. I gotta see if I can fit into it. But anyway, Nancy made it for me.
That would be great. We'll put you down.
And put her down too, because that's a great show.
Absolutely.
Anybody else?
Yeah, that'll be fun.
Did Lincoln ever visit Seward's house in Auburn?
No, did Lincoln ever visit Seward's house in Auburn? 6 presidents did. He's not one of them. I'd like to think he would have if there had not been April 1865. The closest we can get you to if you come to the Seward House, which you should all do, and we'll be decorated for Christmas soon. And on Sunday, I believe it's the 8th or 9th, it's the second Sunday, it's the first Sunday, so it's the 8th. It's the 8th. We're having a free community open house from noon to 4. So that Sunday, live music, the entire house is open. So 0 cost, come see the decorations and come see all this stuff, but all the furniture in the parlor is what Seward had up in his Washington parlor that Lincoln would have sat in. So we can't say Lincoln ever slept here, but we can say Lincoln sat down here. That chair.
Was there anything about going to a religious service that happened with Seward or Lincoln as far as this whole process of Thanksgiving?
So Seward was not at all a religious man. He ran much more like Jefferson. He was pretty agnostic. He didn't get baptized until he was in his late 30s and attended church more to be seen there. Though he and Lincoln would attend the Church of the Presidents in Lafayette Square together, there was a Lincoln pew in the front and a much nicer Seward pew with stained glass window that he gave to that church. But he wasn't pushing that agenda. If you read, and I'm sorry I don't have the full text for you, but if you find the full text of the proclamation, or you listen to our reader, it is very much Washingtonian. It's still wrapped and framed in very strong religious language. It is about the Almighty and giving thanks. So it sounds a lot more like Jefferson. It sounds like Jefferson, but is imposed like Washington. So a bit of a Jeffersonian sound and a Washington bit of forcefulness. Well, thank you all so much for coming out.
You have a standing invitation to visit.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, this was great. I'd like to say thank you, PAC-B TV.
Everybody thank Matt for what he did tonight. Thank you.
Yes.